Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. I have a very different video for you today about playing with watercolor techniques and experimenting with supplies and materials and textural techniques. Now, I'm not going to make a finished project in this video. This is all about how I experiment. And this is for the Scrap Happy blog post. If you want to know more about Scrap Happy, I will leave you links to all of that. So I am experimenting today with salt, both chunky kosher salt and regular table salt, as well as alcohol. If you've never used alcohol with watercolor before, it is really interesting stuff. I've only done these things a few times, so I'm really setting about today to experiment and try what I think I like the best to move towards future projects. So I've got just basic watercolor supplies besides my salt and alcohol with 2 cups of water, my paintbrushes, cleanup paint rag, a watercolor spray bottle, and you did notice that my alcohol was in a spray bottle as well, and we'll use both drips of alcohol and sprays of alcohol through this process. And then I've got my watercolor paper, which is just an inexpensive Strathmore basic watercolor paper. I do have a plastic paint palette, and I did intend to do this project with ink pads because a lot of people have ink pads even if they don't have a watercolor palette. But something comes up in the video that makes me switch over to my watercolor palette, and we'll get to that all later because it's a longer story. Now, if you don't have a plastic paint palette to use, you can make yourself a paint palette out of a piece of scrap plastic from a packaging and just shove a sheet of cardstock inside of there, and I flip it over to the other side so that you won't see any of those words on there, and then you've got yourself a palette. All right, I have this, I think it's like a 9x12 sheet of watercolor paper here. I am going to break this down into little squares to experiment in each little square, and I will make notes on these squares so that I know what I did, what products I used, because I am approaching this in kind of a scientific way, because if you change 5 things about what you're doing, you never know if it's thing 1 or thing 2 that actually was the change that got the end results that you like. So really, I'm trying to do one change at a time. So here, the first thing I'm changing is the water level of my watercolor paint, and I'm using salt to start. So this is the kosher salt with what I call a semi-dry paint. It's just kind of a basic stroke of paint across the paper. So the next square is going to be more wet, and the square after that will be even wetter. So that is the process I'm going through of making just one change at a time to experiment. Now we're coming up to the part where I started having trouble with these ink pads, and what's going to end up happening is that I spray that down and then the paint starts behaving differently. But at this moment in time, I did not realize what I was doing and what I had actually sprayed that paint with. It wasn't the water, it was the alcohol, and that totally changed the paint. And at first I'm thinking, well, maybe there's something wrong with my paper, because sometimes manufacturing defects happen and the paper's absorption quality can be affected. So I tried moving the paint around to different parts of the paper and none of it's working. So I pulled out my paint palette while I just let that stuff sit, because I thought, well, maybe some ink pads have chemistry in them with agents added to affect the drying time. And I thought, well, if it's not my paper, maybe it is the ink after all, even though I've never experienced this with any of my ink pads before. So that is part of experimenting. Things can happen, and I'll show you why this ended up being a good thing in a little bit. So with my paint palettes going on, I am experimenting with different levels of salt with my regular watercolor paints, just to show the differences between ink pads and my watercolor paints. And then I'm going to do, because the very, very wet paints are not having the effect even at this point in the process. You can see I put a little X there because they're just too wet. They're not doing anything. I do go ahead and move on to comparing the semi-dry paint to with the kosher salt and the table salt. So I've already kind of narrowed my ideas down about what I'm starting to like. I like the drier effect that the salt is having. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to the alcohol ink. So I am just painting up swatches here, and then I had a little bit too much water because I wanted to keep this a little bit drier. And when I touch the tip of that spray bottle with the alcohol on there to the paper, and you can see how it immediately creates these rings in the paint. And it seems, I don't know if this is what's actually happening, but it seems to cause the paint to dry faster. So I'm going to try another color with the same alcohol. Because sometimes different, especially with watercolor paints, the pigments will move through the liquid surface differently because they technically have different weights to them. And so I try with different colors as well. Now the next blue square, I just put drips of water to have a side-by-side comparison with the blue left one being alcohol and the blue middle one there being water. I did paint a third blue to let it dry so that I can experiment with both alcohol and water on already dried paint. Now I know how that behaves with water, but I don't really know how it behaves with alcohol, so that's what I wanted to try. And then I created some streaks of alcohol versus water, and this is the point where I realized that when I had sprayed that paint up above, it was with the alcohol bottle. So then I used that alcohol on purpose to try and create different techniques. And so I created one there where I left the alcohol wet and then painted directly over it. And then the square below it, I'm going to let the alcohol dry and then paint on top of it. In the meantime, while that's drying, I move back to my blue square to try putting my alcohol and my water on top of the the dry paint rather, and letting that square do its thing. Now I'm moving on to misting with alcohol on top of a wash of watercolor paint. The watercolor paint on the left there was a much drier wash, and this one on the right here is a much wetter wash, and you can see almost instantly that they're starting to behave differently. The one on the left seemed to dry just almost instantly when I sprayed it. So that is something I definitely learned. Now the misting on the wet alcohol definitely didn't seem to have as much difference between just using water versus alcohol. So that's something I need to play with later. Now here, when I went back to do that red paint on top of the dry alcohol swatches on the right, it didn't behave the same. So then I tried purposely drawing an image with my paintbrush dipped in alcohol and then painting immediately over it, but that image is not showing up. I think the alcohol was bleeding into the fibers of the paper more than I had anticipated. And so that is something that I could play with a little bit more, but right off the bat, I'm not feeling like that was a successful technique. So with all of these ideas under my belt, what sparked another idea for me was a galaxy painting. And this is something I've done in the past, and I haven't ever really been terribly happy with any of my results. So today I'm trying again with these completely different techniques than I've tried in the past to see how I like them. So I paint wet black paint down, and then while it's still wet, I drop in my colorful paint with my paintbrush and try to move it around a little bit. The one on the left, I didn't move as much as I'm doing here on the right. And then the one on the right gets the kosher salt, and the one on the left, I misted immediately while it was still wet with my alcohol inks, and I'm sure to take plenty of notes throughout this whole process. Now, I haven't said yet that when you're using the salt, you want to let your paint dry naturally, because what happens is the salt kind of absorbs the water and it moves the pigment around. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the end results of all these different techniques. First is the kosher salt, and you can see the 3 squares with the drier paint on the left leading up to the wetter paint on the right. Down below here was my watercolor paint as opposed to the ink pad paint that I did with the same process. And here I've got the alcohol drips versus water drips versus the dry paint with both of those things on there. Here is stripes of water versus a stripe of alcohol on wet paint. Here is the alcohol directly to the paper with wet paint on top. And then we've got wet washes of paint with sprays of alcohol on top, a drier paint left, a wetter paint right. And then we moved on to the galaxy painting with spritz of alcohol, and then the galaxy painting with the rock salt on top. And this is the technique that I like the best. The rock salt has this jagged effect to it that I'm not getting from other techniques, so it is the most intriguing to me. Now, I am taking notes later about different things that I want to try to further these techniques along, but this is a process. It's a process of trial and error, and sometimes those errors lead to interesting new trials. When all is said and done, the rock salt galaxy painting technique is likely to become a possible card project in the future. Some of these other techniques are likely to be mixed media background techniques that I could use for scrapbooking pages. When I am done with these trial projects, I will hang them up somewhere or set them up somewhere so I can continue to look at them, because the more I'm repeating these ideas in my head, even without doing them, that repetition helps build the memory, the long-term memory for these techniques in the future. And then I will store them away so that I can reference them should I need to if I've forgotten what I need to do. So that is it for this video. I hope it encourages you to try some techniques without having the expectation of some kind of amazing end product. This is all about learning. Tomorrow, however, I will have a mixed media project for you as part of the Mixed Media Hop for the Mixed Media Frenzy group. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.